My name is Dahlia Armstrong, 67 years old, and I spent 30 years teaching elementary school children in Boston before retiring. The colonial home I purchased with my late husband 35 years ago was my sanctuary, my pride and joy. When my son Ethan and his wife Jessica faced financial hardship, I opened my doors hoping this temporary arrangement would bring our family closer. Instead, it nearly broke me. The day Jessica told me to leave my own home was the day I finally found the courage to reclaim what was mine. Before I share how this all unfolded, let me know where you are watching from, and subscribe to see how I stood my ground and reclaimed both my home and my dignity. Before Ethan and Jessica moved in, my retirement days had a peaceful rhythm that I had grown to cherish. Mornings began with coffee on my back porch, watching cardinals and blue jays visit the bird feeders my husband Thomas had built before he passed away 7 years ago. 3 days a week, I volunteered at the local library, helping with their adult literacy program. Tuesdays were for my book club with 6 other retired teachers. Thursdays and Sundays were dedicated to tending my garden, which bloomed with hydrangeas, roses, and a vegetable patch that yielded more tomatoes and zucchini than I could ever use. My son Ethan had always been a good-hearted boy. Even as a child, he would give away his lunch money to classmates who forgot theirs. This generosity was what I loved most about him, but it came with a downside. Financial responsibility was never his strong suit. Through his 20s and 30s, there were always calls asking for loans to cover rent or car payments. I helped when I could always, hoping that this time would be the lesson that taught him to budget properly. Then came Jessica. They met at a company event 5 years ago. Ethan brought her home for Thanksgiving that same year. My first impression was that she seemed sweet, a pretty woman, with a warm smile and polite manners. She complimented my home, effusively asked about every family photo, and insisted on helping with dishes after dinner. But there were small things, tiny moments that gave me pause. The way she mentioned the brand of her watch when no one had asked. How she subtly criticized the town I lived in as being too quiet and old-fashioned. The comment about how she could never live in such a small house, not realizing that at 2,200 square feet, my home was considered spacious for a single person. Still, I was happy that Ethan had found someone who seemed to care for him. They married 8 months later in a ceremony that cost far more than they could afford. I contributed what I could, though. Jessica made it clear that my offer to host the reception in my garden was not what she had envisioned for her special day. 3 years into their marriage, disaster struck. The marketing firm where both Ethan and Jessica worked underwent a major downsizing. Within the same week, both lost their jobs. They had been living in a luxury apartment downtown, with rent that was already stretching their means when they were both employed. With no income and minimal savings, the eviction notice came quickly. I still remember the phone call. Ethan was in tears explaining their situation. Their credit cards were maxed out. They had 2 weeks to vacate their apartment. They had nowhere to go. Could they possibly stay with me? Just for a few months, he promised. Just until they found new jobs and got back on their feet. 3 months maximum, he swore. How could I say no? This was my son. And despite my reservations about Jessica, she was family now, too. The first week was lovely. They arrived with suitcases and boxes, profusely thanking me as I showed them to the guest room. Jessica hugged me tightly, saying I was saving their lives. Ethan promised they would be the perfect housemates. That evening, Jessica cooked dinner, a delicious pasta dish that she said was her grandmother's recipe. We sat around the dining table, sharing wine and stories, and I felt a warm glow, thinking perhaps this arrangement would indeed bring us closer. The second week continued this honeymoon period. Jessica kept the house spotless. Ethan fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom and the loose step on the back porch, tasks I had been postponing for months. They insisted on grocery shopping, though I noticed they used my credit card without discussion. Still, they were making an effort, and I appreciated it. But by the third week, subtle shifts began. Jessica started leaving her clothes in the living room. The first time, I simply picked them up and placed them on their bed. She thanked me, but with a slight edge to her voice, saying she had left them there intentionally to air out. I apologized, though I was confused why she would choose the living room for this purpose. Small demands began to appear. Jessica mentioned that my laundry detergent irritated her skin, so could we switch to a more expensive brand? The coffee I purchased was too bitter for her taste. Could I get the kind she preferred, which cost twice as much? My morning routine of NPR radio in the kitchen disturbed her sleep, even though their bedroom was at the opposite end of the house. The kitchen became the first battleground. One morning, I came down to find all my cabinets reorganized. Plates that had occupied the same shelf for decades were now stored across the room. Spices were arranged by color rather than alphabetically, as I had always kept them. When I asked Jessica about it, she smiled brightly. My kitchen needed updating anyway, she said. This system made much more sense. She had learned it from an organizational expert on Instagram. When I tried to explain that I preferred my original system, she looked hurt. I was just trying to help, she said. Don't you want things to be better? Ethan, present for this exchange, quickly jumped in. Mom Jessica spent 3 hours organizing everything. Just give it a chance. So I did. I gave it a chance, even as I fumbled through meal preparations, unable to find anything without searching. I gave it a chance when she replaced my comfortable couch cushions with decorative ones that looked beautiful but felt like sitting on stone. I gave it a chance when she suggested my floral curtains were outdated and replaced them with modern blinds that let in half the light. 3 months came and went. There was no mention of moving out. Ethan had found a job, but it paid less than his previous position. Jessica had interviews, but nothing had materialized. When I gently asked about their plans one evening, Jessica burst into tears. The job market was so competitive, she cried. They were trying their best. Did I want them to be homeless? Of course not, I said, quickly ashamed for even bringing it up. By month 5, I realized I had made a grave mistake. The temporary arrangement had become indefinite with no end date in sight. And more concerning, the power dynamic in my own home had shifted dramatically. I was no longer the homeowner generously providing shelter. Somehow imperceptibly, I had become the unwelcome guest in what Jessica increasingly referred to as their home. 6 months into this living arrangement, my home no longer felt like mine. The transformation happened so gradually that I barely noticed it until the process was complete. The living room, once filled with books and family photographs, now showcased Jessica's collection of modern art pieces. My comfortable reading chair had been moved to the basement to make room for their oversized leather recliner. Even the refrigerator had been claimed, with my foods restricted to a single shelf, while Jessica's organic specialty items occupied the rest. The first major incident occurred when I returned from my book club to find my living room furniture completely rearranged. The sofa that had always faced the fireplace now faced the window. The bookshelf that held my treasured first editions had been emptied. The books stacked in boxes in the hallway. Jessica, what happened to the living room? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. She looked up from her phone where she had been scrolling through social media. Oh, I read that this arrangement creates better energy flow. Feng shui, you know, the old setup was blocking positive qi. But I preferred it the way it was, I said. And where are my books going? She sighed as if I was being unreasonable. Those old books were collecting dust and making the room feel cluttered. I thought we could donate them. Those books are not being donated, I said firmly. Some of them were gifts from Thomas. Others are signed first editions. Well, they make the room look like a library, she countered. This is a living space, not a public book repository. When Ethan came home that evening, I expected him to understand my perspective. Instead, he shrugged. Mom Jessica has a really good eye for design. The room does look more spacious this way. Why not give it a chance? Give it a chance. The phrase that was becoming the soundtrack to my diminishing authority in my own home. Meals became another source of tension. Jessica began criticizing my cooking, which had once been a source of pride. My chicken was too dry, my vegetables overcooked, my seasoning bland. She took over dinner, preparations making elaborate meals with ingredients that strained my grocery budget. When I mentioned the expense, she looked wounded. We need proper nutrition, Dahlia, she said, using my first name despite my preference to be called Mom. If the cost is an issue, perhaps we could discuss a different arrangement for expenses. But the different arrangement never materialized. Instead, I continued paying for everything while feeling increasingly unwelcome at my own dinner table. The invasion extended beyond physical spaces. Jessica began inviting her friends over without asking me first. I would come home from volunteering to find 4 or 5 strangers in my living room drinking wine I had purchased, leaving water rings on my wooden tables, their shoes marking my clean floors. The first time it happened, I was caught off guard. "Oh, Dahlia," Jessica said when I walked in, "these are my friends from my yoga class. We decided to have a little get-together." The women barely acknowledged me, continuing their loud conversation about someone named Brandy, who had apparently worn an inappropriate outfit to a baby shower. That night, I spoke to Ethan privately. "Honey, I don't mind Jessica having friends over, but I would appreciate being asked first. This is still my home." His face clouded. "Mom, Jessica is feeling isolated since we moved in here. These social connections are important for her mental health. She didn't think you'd mind since you were out anyway." "I don't mind her having friends over," I repeated. "I just want to be informed beforehand." The next day, Jessica was cold toward me, clearly having been told about our conversation. She left dirty dishes in the sink for the first time, a passive-aggressive response that would become a pattern whenever she felt slighted. Ethan was caught in the middle but consistently chose the path of least resistance, which inevitably meant siding with Jessica. When I asked him to talk to her about using my credit card without permission, he promised he would, but nothing changed. When I mentioned that her late-night television watching kept me awake, he suggested I get earplugs. Meanwhile, financial strain was becoming unbearable. I was retired, living on a fixed income from my pension and Social Security. My budget had been carefully planned for one person, not 3. Yet, I was now covering utilities that had doubled grocery bills, that had tripled, and unexpected expenses like Jessica's premium skincare products that somehow ended up on my credit card statement. What troubled me most was watching them spend money on luxuries while contributing nothing to the household. Ethan bought a new gaming system. Jessica came home with shopping bags from expensive boutiques. When I asked Ethan about setting up a contribution system now that he was working again, he looked embarrassed. "We're still catching up on debt, Mom. Just give us a little more time." More time. More chances. More of my space, my peace, my money. I began retreating to my bedroom more often, the only place that remained somewhat mine, though even that sanctuary had been compromised when Jessica decided to use my ensuite bathroom because it had better lighting for applying her makeup. My neighbor and close friend Margaret noticed the change in me during our weekly walks. "Dahlia, you don't seem yourself lately," she observed one morning. "You seem quieter, more withdrawn." I tried to brush it off, but Margaret had known me for 20 years. She wasn't easily fooled. "It's the living situation, isn't it?" she pressed. "Are Ethan and Jessica still planning to move out soon?" The question pierced the careful facade I'd been maintaining. To my horror, tears sprang to my eyes. "I don't think they have any intention of leaving," I admitted. "And I don't know how to make them without feeling like a terrible mother." Margaret took my hand. "Being a good mother doesn't mean being a doormat, Dahlia. You need to establish boundaries before you have nothing left to give." I knew she was right, but the thought of confrontation made my stomach clench. I had always been a peacekeeper, a trait that had served me well as a teacher, but was now enabling my own mistreatment. But events were building toward a breaking point, whether I was ready or not. The tension in the house was becoming palpable, and I could feel something inside me shifting from resignation toward something else entirely, something with sharper edges and a voice that was tired of being silenced. 8 months into our living arrangement, a series of incidents occurred that could no longer be brushed aside or excused away. The first happened on a Saturday afternoon when I returned from grocery shopping to find Jessica sitting cross-legged on my living room floor, surrounded by open photo albums, my most treasured possessions scattered carelessly around her. These were not ordinary photo albums. They contained the visual history of my life, with Thomas' 40 years of marriage meticulously documented and lovingly preserved. Our wedding, the birth of Ethan, family vacations, the small, ordinary moments that become precious only in retrospect. I had organized them chronologically, each photo carefully mounted with acid-free adhesive dates and descriptions neatly written beneath in my best handwriting. "What are you doing?" I asked, unable to keep the alarm from my voice. Jessica looked up, seemingly oblivious to my distress. "Oh, I decided to reorganize these old albums. They were so cluttered and outdated. I'm creating a more aesthetic arrangement by color scheme and visual impact, rather than boring chronology." I stared in horror at the dismantled pages. Photos that had been carefully placed decades ago were now removed from their protective sleeves, some bent at the corners, others stacked in piles without any apparent system. "Jessica, please stop," I said, my voice trembling. "These albums are extremely important to me. They need to stay exactly as they were." She rolled her eyes. "Dahlia, no offense, but your organizational system is from the Stone Age. No one does photo albums like this anymore. I'm doing you a favor by modernizing them." "I don't want them modernized," I said more firmly now. "Please put everything back exactly as it was." Jessica sighed dramatically. "I already spent 2 hours on this. I'm not going to waste all that effort just because you can't appreciate a modern aesthetic." I was about to insist when Ethan walked in. Sensing the tension, he asked what was happening. When I explained, his response stunned me. "Mom, Jessica was just trying to help," he said. "She has a great eye for design. Why don't you let her finish and see if you like it?" "Because these are my personal photo albums," I replied, struggling to maintain composure. "They contain irreplaceable memories of your father and our life together. They were perfectly organized already." Jessica made a dismissive noise. "It's not like I'm throwing anything away. I'm just making them look better." In the end, I gathered the albums myself, taking them to my bedroom and locking the door, something I had never done before in my own home. Later, I discovered that several photos had been damaged beyond repair, including a precious image of Thomas holding newborn Ethan in the hospital, now creased across the middle. A week after the photo album incident, I was reviewing my credit card statement when I noticed several charges. I didn't recognize a $300 spa treatment, a wine club membership, and multiple restaurant charges on days when I had been at home eating leftovers alone while Ethan and Jessica were out. When I confronted Ethan, he had the grace to look ashamed. Jessica had been using my credit card for personal expenses without my knowledge or permission. It was a violation that went beyond financial burden. It was a betrayal of trust. "I know we should have asked Mom," he said. "But Jessica was really stressed about job hunting, and I thought the spa would help her relax. We were planning to pay you back." When I asked, "And why use my card without asking?" he had no good answer, just more promises to do, better promises that by now rang hollow. The third incident involved a dog. I returned from my book club to find a large golden retriever bounding through my living room, muddy paws marking my cream-colored carpet. Jessica was laughing, encouraging the animal as it jumped on my sofa. "Whose dog is this?" I asked, even as my sinuses began to clog from my well-documented dog allergy. "Oh, this is Cooper," Jessica announced brightly. "Isn't he gorgeous? He's ours now." "What do you mean ours?" I asked, backing away as the dog approached me, sniffing enthusiastically. "We adopted him this morning," Ethan explained, entering from the kitchen. "Jessica has always wanted a golden retriever." I looked from one to the other in disbelief. "But I'm allergic to dogs." "You know this. I can't have a dog in the house." Jessica waved her hand dismissively. "Allergies are mostly psychological. Besides, Cooper is hypoallergenic." "No golden retriever is hypoallergenic," I said already, feeling my eyes beginning to itch. "Jessica, Ethan, I cannot have a dog in this house. My doctor has confirmed my allergies are severe." "Well, Cooper needs a home," Jessica said stubbornly. "And we want a dog." "Then you need to find your own place to live," I replied more forcefully than I had spoken to either of them before. The statement hung in the air. Ethan looked uncomfortable. Jessica narrowed her eyes. "You can't possibly expect us to get rid of Cooper just because you think you're allergic," she said coldly. Eventually, after 3 days of escalating allergy symptoms that left me barely able to breathe, they reluctantly rehomed the dog with Jessica's friend. But the incident left a bitter residue. a clear demonstration that my well-being ranked far below their desires. Perhaps the most heartbreaking incident involved my garden. Gardening had been my salvation after Thomas died, the physical labor and quiet communion with growing things helping me process my grief. Every plant had been chosen with care. The rose bushes were anniversary gifts from Thomas. The hydrangeas had been propagated from my mother's garden. The vegetable patch was planned and expanded over years of learning what thrived in that particular spot of earth. I came home from volunteering one day to find half my garden torn out. The roses, the hydrangeas, the carefully tended perennials all gone. In their place was churned earth and Jessica directing two landscapers who were installing modern geometric stone features and gravel. "What is happening?" I cried, rushing across the lawn. Jessica beamed. "Surprise, we're updating your outdated garden with a modern, low-maintenance landscape design. No more messy plants dropping leaves and petals everywhere." "Those plants were irreplaceable," I said, my voice breaking as I stared at the discarded rose bushes, some still with blooms tossed unceremoniously into a waste pile. "They're just plants, Dahlia," she replied. "They were making the yard look cluttered and old-fashioned. This clean, contemporary design will increase your property value." "I don't care about property value," I whispered. This was my sanctuary. For the first time, even Ethan seemed to recognize a line had been crossed. He pulled Jessica aside, and I heard fragments of a heated discussion. The landscapers were sent away, but the damage was already done. Half my garden years of patient tending and growing, destroyed in an afternoon on Jessica's whim. These incidents took a toll on my health. I began experiencing insomnia, lying awake, listening to Jessica and Ethan moving about in my home as if I was the guest. I lost weight, my clothes hanging loose on my frame. The constant tension gave me headaches, and the stress of financial strain added to my anxiety. Margaret noticed immediately. "Dahlia, you look unwell," she said bluntly during our walk. "Have you seen a doctor?" I admitted I hadn't, but downplayed my symptoms. Margaret wasn't fooled. "This situation is making you ill," she said. "You need to assert yourself. This is your home. You are allowing them to take advantage of your generosity." "I know," I said quietly. "But he's my son. And every time I try to establish a boundary, I'm made to feel like I'm being unreasonable or unkind." Margaret stopped walking and faced me directly. "Being kind doesn't mean being a victim. You can love your son while still demanding respect." Her words stayed with me, echoing in my mind during sleepless nights and tense meals. The next weekend, my brother Frank came to visit, the first family member to see the situation firsthand. Frank had always been protective of me, especially since Thomas died. The changes in my home and in me did not escape his notice. "What the hell is going on here, Dahlia?" he asked, privately, after observing a dinner where Jessica dominated the conversation, interrupted me repeatedly, and sent Ethan to fetch things for her like a servant. I broke down and told him everything. The financial burden, the territorial takeover of my home, the damaged photos, the destroyed garden, the credit card, the dog. Frank was furious. That evening, he had a long, closed-door conversation with Ethan. I don't know exactly what was said, but the next morning, Jessica was noticeably subdued. Ethan apologized for not being more considerate and promised things would change. For a week after Frank left, there was improvement. Jessica cleaned up after herself. Ethan offered to pay for groceries. They kept the television volume low in the evenings. But as days passed, old patterns reemerged. Jessica's resentment at being called out manifested in cold silence toward me, speaking to me only when absolutely necessary, and then with barely concealed contempt. I knew something had to change. I couldn't continue living as a stranger in my own home. But the breaking point was still to come, an incident so egregious that it would finally push me past my threshold of tolerance and into action. The second week of October marked the anniversary of Thomas's passing. For the previous 7 years, I had observed this difficult day with a small ritual that brought me comfort. I would prepare Thomas's favorite meal, roast beef, with Yorkshire pudding, set the table with our wedding china light candles, and invite one or two close friends to share memories of my beloved husband. It was a way of honoring his memory while ensuring the day wasn't spent in solitary grief. This year would be no different. I had invited Margaret and our mutual friend Eleanor, both of whom had known Thomas for decades. I had ordered a small roast from the butcher, splurging a bit on prime quality as Thomas would have appreciated. The day before, I polished the silver serving pieces that had been wedding gifts and rarely saw use anymore. That same evening, I overheard Jessica on the phone in the living room. "Yes, everyone should come around 7, she was saying enthusiastically. "We're doing a fall cocktail party. Dahlia won't mind, she never uses the dining room anyway. Bring Mark and Christina if they want to come. The more the merrier." My heart sank. I entered the room after she hung up. "Jessica, I couldn't help overhearing. Are you planning a party for tomorrow night?" She nodded, scrolling through her phone without looking up. "Just a small get-together. Some of my old colleagues are in town. I thought it would be nice to reconnect." "I won't be able to accommodate a party tomorrow," I said carefully. "Tomorrow is the anniversary of Thomas's death. I have a small dinner planned with Margaret and Eleanor. It's been on the calendar for weeks." Now Jessica looked up, annoyance flashing across her face. "You can't be serious. My friends are already committed. Some are driving in from out of town." "I'm very serious," I replied. "This date has significant meaning for me, and I planned this dinner well in advance." Jessica stood up, her posture confrontational. "Well, I can't cancel now. People have made arrangements. Besides, isn't it a bit morbid to keep observing death anniversaries year after year? It might be healthier to move on." Her callousness struck me like a physical blow. I stared at her, momentarily speechless. Ethan, who had been in the kitchen, came in, sensing conflict. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between us. "Your mother is being difficult about my little get-together tomorrow," Jessica said before I could speak. "Apparently she scheduled some depressing death dinner for the same night." "Ethan," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady, "tomorrow is the anniversary of your father's death. As you know, I always have a small dinner with close friends. Jessica is trying to plan a cocktail party for the same evening. I expected my son to understand, to support me in this at least. Instead, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Mom, maybe this year you could do your dinner another night. Jessica has already invited people." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Another night, as if my husband had died on a more convenient date. "No," I said firmly. "My plans stand. Jessica will need to reschedule her party." Jessica scoffed. "You are being incredibly selfish right now." "Selfish." I repeated the word, landing like a slap. "I'm selfish for wanting to honor your father's memory in my own home." "Our home," Jessica corrected sharply. "We live here too, or had you forgotten?" The phrase "our home" hit me like ice water. In Jessica's mind, my house had become communal property simply because I had generously offered temporary shelter. The argument escalated, with Jessica eventually storming out, and Ethan following her, casting me a disappointed look as if I were a child behaving badly. I stood alone in my living room, shaking with a mixture of grief and anger. The next morning, I decided to look for Thomas's watch. It was a vintage Omega that I had given him on our 20th anniversary. He had worn it every day until his final hospitalization. Since his death, I had kept it in my jewelry box, taking it out occasionally to hold something that had been so much a part of him. I wanted to place it on the dinner table that evening, another small way of making his presence felt. But the watch wasn't in my jewelry box. At first, I thought I might have misplaced it, though I was typically meticulous with Thomas's things. I searched my dresser drawers, my closet, even under the bed, growing increasingly frantic. The watch was nowhere to be found. A horrible suspicion began to form. I went to the guest room where Ethan and Jessica slept. They had both left for the day, Ethan to work, and Jessica to meet friends. The room was a mess, clothes strewn about bed unmade. I had long since given up expecting them to maintain any standards of tidiness. On the dresser was Jessica's jewelry box. I hesitated, not wanting to invade her privacy, but desperate to find Thomas's watch. The watch wasn't there, but something else caught my eye. A receipt from a pawn shop dated 2 weeks earlier, for a vintage Omega watch. The room seemed to spin around me. Jessica had pawned Thomas's watch. An irreplaceable memento of my husband, something of deep sentimental value that she had no right to touch, let alone sell. I sat on the edge of their bed, the receipt clutched in my trembling hand as an odd calm settled over me. This was beyond disrespect, beyond taking advantage. This was a deliberate act of cruelty. When Ethan and Jessica returned that evening, they were surprised to find the dining room table set for 3, not for a cocktail party. Jessica immediately launched into an argument, but I held up my hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Before you say anything else," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months. "I want to know about this." I held out the pawn ticket. Ethan looked confused, but Jessica's face drained of color. "You went through my things," she accused, attempting to deflect. "Thomas's watch is missing," I said. "Did you take it?" Jessica glanced at Ethan, then back at me. Her chin lifted defiantly. "That old watch was just sitting there collecting dust," she said. "No one was using it. We needed money for Cooper's adoption fees. It seemed practical. You pawned my dead husband's watch to buy a dog I'm allergic to." I clarified, wanting to be absolutely certain I understood the depths of this betrayal. Ethan looked horrified, apparently genuinely unaware of what Jessica had done. She must have told him they got the money elsewhere. "Jess, you didn't," he said. "That was Dad's watch." Jessica rolled her eyes. "It's just a watch. An object. Dahlia has plenty of other keepsakes." Something shifted in me then, a fundamental realignment. The grief and hurt were still there, but alongside them rose something new. Resolve, clarity. A recognition that this situation had become untenable, and that I was the only one who could change it. "I need both of you to understand something," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "This is my home. I have allowed you to stay here out of love and concern, but I will not be disrespected in my own house. I will not have my possessions taken and sold. I will not be made to feel like an intruder in the home I have owned for 35 years. Jessica laughed dismissively. "If you don't like living with us, feel free to leave," she said. The room went silent. Even Jessica seemed to realize she had crossed a line with this statement. Ethan stared at her, then at me, but said nothing in my defense. I looked at my daughter-in-law, really looked at her, seeing clearly the entitled, manipulative person she was. And I looked at my son, recognizing his weakness, his willingness to sacrifice his relationship with me to avoid conflict with his wife. At that moment, something broke and reformed in me. The passive, accommodating Dahlia, who had allowed herself to be gradually erased from her own home, died. In her place stood someone new, someone with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. "I will not be leaving," I said calmly. "But things are going to change around here, starting right now." The morning after our confrontation, I called in sick to my volunteer position at the library for the first time in years. I had important business to attend to, preparations that could not wait. My first call was to a lawyer, an old friend of Thomas's named Richard Harmon, who had helped with my husband's will and estate. "Richard, I need advice," I said after exchanging pleasantries. "My son and his wife have been living with me for nearly a year. The arrangement has become problematic. I need to understand my legal rights regarding asking them to leave." Richard listened carefully as I outlined the situation, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he sighed. "Dahlia, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Since they've been there so long and receive mail at your address, they're technically tenants under the law even without a formal agreement or rent payments. You can't simply change the locks." I felt my heart sink, but Richard continued. "However, as the homeowner, you have every right to give them proper notice to vacate. In Massachusetts, that's 30 days. I suggest putting it in writing. If they refuse to leave after that period, then we can discuss further legal options, including formal eviction." While his answer wasn't what I'd hoped for, it gave me a clear path forward. Richard promised to email me a template for a formal notice to vacate that I could customize. My next task was documentation. I spent hours combing through financial records, creating a detailed accounting of every expense I had covered since Ethan and Jessica moved in. The total was staggering, well over $20,000, when including food utilities and the unauthorized credit card charges. I made copies of everything, including the pawn ticket for Thomas's watch. I also took photographs of the damage to my home and garden, creating a visual record of what had been lost or altered without my permission. The before and after pictures of my garden were particularly heartbreaking, showing the lush, colorful space that had been partially transformed into a sterile rock garden. My final preparation was a visit to my bank, where I opened a new checking account and ordered a new credit card. I transferred funds from my joint account, leaving only enough to cover outstanding checks. I then contacted all my automatic payment services to update my banking information effectively, cutting off Jessica's access to my finances. By the time Ethan came home from work that evening, I was ready. I asked him to sit with me in the kitchen for a private conversation. Jessica was out with friends, which was perfect for what I needed to say. "Ethan," I began, "I love you. You are my son, and nothing will ever change that. But this living situation cannot continue as it is." He started to speak, likely to offer more empty promises of improvement, but I held up my hand. "Please let me finish. You and Jessica have been here for nearly a year. What was supposed to be temporary has become permanent, and in that time I have been systematically pushed aside in my own home. My possessions have been damaged or sold. My space has been invaded. My financial resources have been drained." I slid the folder of financial records across the table to him. His face paled as he flipped through the pages, seeing the total amount itemized. "I didn't realize it was this much," he murmured. "I know," I said, "and I gave willingly because I wanted to help. But the situation has become untenable. Jessica's behavior yesterday was the final straw. No one tells me to leave my own home." "What are you saying, Mom?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "I'm saying you have 30 days to find alternative accommodation," I replied, keeping my tone gentle but firm. "I've drawn up a formal notice to vacate, which I'll give to both you and Jessica. I've spoken with a lawyer and understand my rights as a homeowner." Ethan's face crumpled. "Where are we supposed to go? We don't have enough saved for a security deposit and first month's rent." I had anticipated this. "I've set aside $3,000 to help with your moving expenses," I said. "It's a gift, not a loan, but it comes with conditions. First, Thomas's watch must be retrieved from the pawn shop immediately. Second, there will be no more unauthorized use of my credit cards or bank accounts. And third, you will treat me with respect for the remaining time you're in my home." The conversation continued for over an hour. Ethan cycled through disbelief, anger, bargaining, and finally reluctant acceptance. I remained calm throughout, neither raising my voice nor backing down. When he asked if this was really what I wanted, I was honest. What I wanted was for my son and his wife to live independently and visit often for Sunday dinners and holidays. What I wanted was respect and consideration. What I got instead was taken advantage of to the point where my health suffered. So yes, this is what I want now, because it's what I need. Ethan left the kitchen looking defeated but thoughtful. I suspected he knew deep down that things had gone too far. Jessica's reaction when she returned home and was presented with the notice to vacate was predictably explosive. She accused me of betrayal, of abandoning them, of being selfish and cruel. When these tactics didn't move me, she switched to tears, claiming they would end up homeless, that I was destroying their marriage, that I had never given her a fair chance. Through it all, I remained steady. This was my home. I had been more than generous. The decision was final. The next morning, I began the process of reclaiming my space. I started in the living room, moving furniture back to its original position, placing my books back on the shelves, hanging my own artwork on the walls. Jessica watched from the doorway, arms crossed, face tight with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "Restoring my home," I replied, simply continuing my work without looking at her. "You can't just move our things," she said. "I'm moving my things back where they belong," I corrected her. "Your things will need to be packed for your upcoming move." She stormed off, and I continued working methodically through the house, room by room. When I reached the guest room, I began gathering their scattered possessions, placing clothes in suitcases, personal items in boxes. I wasn't being rough or disrespectful, simply organizing what would need to be packed. That's when Jessica found me. She stood in the doorway, her face contorted with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing now?" she shrieked. "You're packing our things." "Just getting a head start," I said calmly. "You have quite a bit to organize before moving day." She pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen as she typed furiously. I continued folding Ethan's shirts, placing them neatly in a suitcase. 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the front door. I went to answer it, surprised to find 2 police officers standing on my porch. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the taller officer said. "I'm Officer Thompson, and this is Officer Rivera. We received a call about a disturbance at this address." Jessica appeared behind me, her expression triumphant. "That's her officers," she said, pointing at me. "She's having some kind of breakdown. She's throwing our belongings around and threatening to put us out on the street." I blinked in surprise at this blatant misrepresentation. "Ma'am, is that accurate?" Officer Thompson asked me. "No, it is not," I replied calmly. "I own this house. My son and his wife have been staying with me temporarily. I've given them formal notice to vacate in 30 days, as is my legal right as the homeowner. I was simply helping organize their belongings for the move." Jessica interrupted. "She's confused. We've been living here for almost a year. This is our home too, and she's having some kind of episode. She needs help." The officers exchanged glances. "Ma'am," I said to Officer Thompson, "I'm happy to show you my deed of ownership, the property tax bills in my name, and the formal notice to vacate that I prepared after consulting with my attorney. I'm of sound mind and body, as my doctor would attest. I'm simply exercising my rights as a property owner." Something in my calm demeanor must have registered with the officers. Officer Thompson asked to see my documentation, which I readily provided. She reviewed it carefully, then turned to Jessica. "Ma'am, everything appears to be in order. Mrs. Armstrong is the legal owner of this property. She has the right to give proper notice to vacate." Jessica's face reddened. "But she's clearly not well. Look at what she's doing, packing our things without permission." Officer Rivera spoke up. "From what we can see, there's no evidence of any mental health crisis. This appears to be a landlord-tenant dispute. Mrs. Armstrong is following proper legal procedures." Jessica tried several more tactics, from crying to accusing me of elder abuse against myself, a claim so absurd that Officer Thompson actually had to suppress a smile. Eventually, the officers prepared to leave, having determined there was no cause for intervention. Before departing, Officer Thompson pulled me aside. "Ma'am, given the tension here, I'd recommend documenting everything moving forward. If you feel threatened at any point, don't hesitate to call us." I thanked her for her professionalism. As the police car pulled away, I turned to find Jessica glaring at me with pure hatred. Behind her stood Ethan, who had arrived home during the police visit, his expression a mix of embarrassment and resignation. "You won't get away with this," Jessica hissed, before storming past me into the house. But I already had. The first battle in reclaiming my home had been won, and I felt stronger than I had in months. The days following the police visit were filled with a tense, brittle silence. Jessica spoke to me only when absolutely necessary, her words clipped and cold. Ethan was caught in the middle, clearly uncomfortable, but still unwilling to directly challenge his wife's behavior. He made awkward attempts at normal conversation with me, but his eyes held a mixture of resentment and shame that made genuine communication impossible. I continued my methodical reclamation of my home. I replaced the modern blinds with my floral curtains. I reorganized the kitchen back to my preferred system. I began researching gardeners who could help restore what remained of my beloved garden when spring arrived. A week after issuing the notice to vacate, I received a phone call that lifted my spirits considerably. It was from the pawn shop. Thomas's watch had been redeemed and was being held for pickup. I later learned that Ethan had gone there himself, using part of the money I had set aside for their moving expenses. It was a small gesture of contrition, but it meant everything to me. The day I brought the watch home, I sat on my bed, cradling it, feeling the familiar weight in my palm, running my thumb over the worn leather strap that had molded to Thomas's wrist over decades. The relief of having this piece of him back was overwhelming, and for the first time in months, I wept freely, releasing some of the grief and tension I had been carrying. My support system rallied around me during this difficult transition. Margaret came over, frequently bringing meals and keeping me company. My brother Frank called daily to check on me. Other friends who had gradually stopped visiting because of Jessica's cold reception began to return, filling my home once more with warmth and genuine conversation. Eleanor, my oldest friend, was particularly supportive. When she heard what had happened, she drove 3 hours to spend a weekend with me, helping me sort through damaged photo albums and offering to have some of the creased photos professionally restored. "They took advantage of your kindness, Dahlia," she said as we worked. "But I'm so proud of you for finally standing up for yourself." Her approval meant more than she knew. For months, Id questioned whether I was being unreasonable, whether my expectations were outdated or my boundaries too rigid. Having the validation of people who knew and loved me helped strengthen my resolve during moments of doubt. Approximately 2 weeks into the 30-day notice period, there was an unexpected development. I came home from grocery shopping to find Ethan sitting alone at the kitchen table, an untouched cup of coffee before him. His posture was slumped, his eyes red-rimmed. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. I set my bags down and joined him, bracing myself for another round of pleas or accusations. Instead, Ethan surprised me. "I want to apologize," he began. "Really apologize, not just say the words. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, and I'm ashamed of how I've allowed you to be treated in your own home, how I've treated you myself." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. I remained silent, allowing him to continue. "Jessica and I had a huge fight last night," he admitted. "About everything. The watch, the credit cards, the garden, calling the police on you. I finally stood up to her, told her that what we've been doing is wrong, that you deserve better, that I've been a terrible son." "What happened?" I asked quietly. He sighed. "She stormed out, said she was staying with a friend. But before she left, she said something that really hit me. She said I'd always choose you over her in the end, that I was a mama's boy. The thing is, I realized I haven't been choosing you at all. I've been choosing the path of least resistance, which meant giving in to Jessica's demands and ignoring how they affected you." His eyes met mine, vulnerable and sincere. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want you to know I see what's been happening and I'm going to do better regardless of what happens with Jessica and me." The knot of hurt that had been lodged in my chest for months loosened slightly. This was my son, the boy I had raised to be thoughtful and kind. Somewhere along the way, he had lost himself in his relationship with Jessica, but perhaps he was finding his way back. "I want to believe you, Ethan," I said carefully. "But there have been many promises before." He nodded. "I know. That's why I'm not asking you to change your mind about us moving out. We need to leave. I need to stand on my own 2 feet. Figure out who I am apart from Jessica and apart from being your son living under your roof. But I'm hoping we can start rebuilding our relationship even from a distance." We talked for hours that afternoon, more honestly than we had in years. Ethan revealed the extent of his unhappiness in his marriage, how Jessica's materialistic values had never aligned with his own more modest aspirations. He admitted to feeling trapped between his loyalty to me and his commitment to his wife, ultimately failing both of us by refusing to make hard choices. I shared my own feelings of betrayal and invisibility. The pain of watching my home and autonomy gradually eroded the loneliness of having my own son become complicit in my mistreatment. It was a difficult conversation, punctuated by tears on both sides, but necessary for any hope of healing. Jessica returned 2 days later, her demeanor notably different. The open hostility was gone, replaced by a careful politeness that was almost more unsettling. She began actively packing their belongings, spending hours on her phone, presumably searching for new housing. When she spoke to me, it was with a stiff formality, as if addressing a stranger. I later learned from Ethan that their fight had indeed been a turning point. He had threatened divorce if she didn't acknowledge her behavior and make genuine changes. While I doubted her sudden compliance sprang from genuine remorse rather than self-preservation, I was grateful for the improved atmosphere in the house. A week before the move-out date, Jessica approached me as I was preparing dinner. "Dahlia," she began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I want to apologize for my behavior, particularly about Thomas's watch and calling the police. That was inexcusable." I regarded her carefully, noting the lack of warmth in her eyes despite her contrite words. This was not a heartfelt apology, but a strategic one. Still, it was more than I had expected from her. "Thank you for saying that, Jessica," I replied evenly. "I appreciate the apology." She nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else. Ethan and I have found an apartment. It's small, but in a good location. The landlord wants references. I was wondering if you would." Despite everything, she was asking me to vouch for them as tenants. The irony was almost amusing. "I'll tell the truth if contacted," I said. "That you stayed here for nearly a year. That you kept the space reasonably clean. That there was no property damage beyond normal wear and tear." I kept my voice neutral, not mentioning the garden, the sold possessions, the boundary violations. Those weren't issues a landlord would typically be concerned with. Jessica looked relieved. "Thank you. We'll be out by next Friday, a few days ahead of the deadline." As she turned to leave, I called after her. "Jessica, I truly hope you and Ethan find happiness in your new place. Sometimes a fresh start is what a relationship needs." She looked back, surprised by what she must have perceived as an olive branch. For a brief moment, I glimpsed something like regret in her expression before her usual mask of composure returned. She nodded once and continued on her way. True to their word, Ethan and Jessica moved out the following Friday. The process was remarkably orderly, with professional movers handling the furniture they had accumulated during their stay. I maintained a dignified distance, neither helping nor hindering, simply observing as my home was gradually restored to its previous state of calm. When the last box was loaded, Ethan approached me alone. Jessica was already in their car engine, running gaze fixed pointedly forward. "Thank you, Mom," he said softly. "For everything. The roof over our heads when we needed it. The money for the security deposit. But mostly for not giving up on me even when I gave you every reason to." I embraced my son, feeling the familiar contours of his shoulders beneath my hands. "I could never give up on you," I told him. "Just promise me you'll remember your worth and not let anyone diminish you the way I almost did." He promised to call soon to visit for Sunday dinners when things settled to work on rebuilding what had been broken between us. Whether these promises would be kept remained to be seen, but as I watched them drive away, I felt a cautious hope. Not for an immediate restoration of what was lost, but for the possibility of something new, and perhaps stronger, being built in its place. That night, I sat alone in my reclaimed living room, Thomas's watch on the side table beside me. The house quiet in a way it hadn't been in almost a year. The silence was not lonely, but peaceful, filled with possibility rather than absence. For the first time in months, I could breathe freely in my own home. The first week after Ethan and Jessica left, I moved through my house like someone exploring a familiar place that had somehow been subtly altered. Rooms that had felt confined now seemed spacious again. The kitchen no longer. Jessica's territory welcomed me back, with its well-worn countertops and the gentle tick of the wall clock Thomas had hung 20 years ago. I reacquainted myself with my home, relearning its rhythms and reclaiming its spaces. The physical restoration came first. I rehung artwork that had been relegated to the attic, family photographs and landscapes that told the story of my life. I moved furniture back to arrangements that made sense to me, prioritizing comfort over what Jessica had called aesthetic impact. I replaced throw pillows and blankets in colors. I loved greens and blues that reminded me of ocean visits with Thomas, rather than the stark blacks and whites Jessica had preferred. The garden was a longer project, one that would need to wait for spring. But I began planning immediately, sketching new layouts that would incorporate what remained of my original plantings with new additions. I contacted a local nursery about propagating new roses similar to those that had been lost. The owner, upon hearing my story, offered to donate several heritage rose bushes to help me rebuild. People often underestimate the emotional impact of physical surroundings. As my home gradually returned to a place that reflected me rather than someone else's vision, I found my spirits lifting, my confidence returning. There was deep satisfaction in small acts of reclamation, putting books on shelves where I could easily reach them using the teapot I'd always loved. But Jessica had declared tacky playing my classical music at breakfast without worrying about offending anyone. Yet alongside this practical restoration came more complex emotional work. I had to process not just what had happened with Ethan and Jessica, but my own role in allowing it to continue for so long. Why had I remained silent when my boundaries were first crossed? Why had I prioritized peace over self-respect? What patterns from my past had made me vulnerable to such treatment? These questions led me to seek out a therapist, Dr. Harriet James, a kind woman in her 60s who specialized in family dynamics. In her comfortable office with its shelf of well-worn psychology books and soft green plants, I gradually unpacked the layers of my experience. I think I was afraid of losing my son, I admitted during one session. Afraid that if I stood up to Jessica, Ethan would choose her and I would be alone. Dr. James nodded thoughtfully. That's a common fear for parents of adult children. But what happened when you did finally stand up for yourself? I considered this. He initially pulled away. But then he saw more clearly what was happening. In some ways, it actually improved our relationship. Because authentic relationships require honest boundaries, Dr. James suggested. When we don't set limits out of fear of losing someone, we often end up losing ourselves instead. And paradoxically, that self-erasure frequently damages the very relationship we're trying to preserve. This insight resonated deeply. In trying to keep Ethan close by accommodating Jessica's increasingly unreasonable behavior, I had become someone my son couldn't fully respect, a doormat, rather than the strong mother who had raised him. By finally asserting myself, I had actually reminded him of who I truly was. Margaret became my steadfast companion during this healing period. She brought over casseroles in those first days when cooking felt overwhelming, sat with me through evenings when the house felt too quiet, listened without judgment when I needed to vent lingering frustrations. You know what the strangest thing is, I told her one afternoon as we planted bulbs for spring. I actually feel grateful in some ways for what happened. Not for the hurt or disrespect, but for what it taught me about myself. Margaret looked up from her gardening trowel. What did it teach you? That I'm stronger than I thought. That I can survive conflict and come out the other side. That standing up for myself doesn't make me selfish or mean. She smiled. I always knew those things about you, Dahlia. I'm just glad you discovered them too. My brother Frank visited a month after Ethan and Jessica moved out. He whistled appreciatively as he entered the house. Place looks like you again, sis, he observed. Got your spirit back in the walls. His comment captured something essential about what had happened. It wasn't just that my physical spaces had been altered during Jessica and Ethan's stay. Something more fundamental had been at risk. My sense of self, my identity, as expressed through my home and possessions. In reclaiming my space, I had reaffirmed who I was. Ethan called weekly, our conversations initially cautious but gradually warming. 2 months after moving out, he asked if he could visit for Sunday dinner alone. I agreed, both nervous and hopeful about what this might mean. He arrived with flowers and a homemade apple pie, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in years. Over pot roast and mashed potatoes, he shared updates about his new job and apartment. Only toward the end of the meal did the conversation turn to Jessica. We're seeing a marriage counselor, he said, pushing his dessert plate aside. It's been helpful, but I don't know if we're going to make it. There are some fundamental differences in how we see the world. I kept my expression neutral, neither encouraging a split nor pushing for reconciliation. Whatever happens, I hope you both find peace, I said, meaning it. Everyone deserves to be in a relationship where they feel valued and respected. He nodded, then looked around the dining room, taking in the familiar furniture, the photos on the wall, the centerpiece I had made from dried flowers from my recovering garden. I'm so sorry, Mom, he said suddenly, his voice thick. I don't think I fully understood what we did to you until now. Being back here, seeing everything restored to how it should be, I let her push you out of your own home. I reached across the table and took his hand. What matters is that you see it now. We can't change what happened, but we can learn from it. I have. I hope you have too. He squeezed my fingers. I have. I'm never going to let anyone treat you that way again. And I'm not going to let anyone treat me that way either. In that moment, I felt a surge of pride in my son. Perhaps the painful experience had been a necessary catalyst for his own growth. A harsh but effective lesson in recognizing toxic dynamics and finding the courage to address them. 6 months after reclaiming my home, I joined a support group for parents navigating difficult relationships with adult children. The group met weekly in the community center. 10 of us sitting in a circle, sharing stories of entitlement, estrangement, reconciliation, and the complex emotions that came with loving someone who had hurt you. I was surprised to find how common my experience was. Other parents had opened their homes to adult children, only to find themselves gradually marginalized. Some had stories far more heartbreaking than mine: financial exploitation that left them destitute, verbal abuse that destroyed their confidence, years of manipulation that isolated them from other family members. Through sharing our stories, we found not only solidarity but practical wisdom, strategies for setting boundaries without severing connections, ways to offer support without enabling dependence, methods for processing grief and anger without being consumed by bitterness. I both received and offered insights, finding healing in the exchange. When asked what I would have done differently, I was honest. I would have established clear terms before they moved in duration, financial expectations, household responsibilities. I would have addressed the first boundary violation immediately rather than letting it slide to keep peace. I would have recognized that true love doesn't require self-erasure. But I also acknowledged what I had done right. I had eventually found my voice. I had taken legal and practical steps to protect myself. I had not allowed guilt or fear to deter me once I recognized what needed to be done. And perhaps most importantly, I had kept the door open for a renewed relationship with my son, separating his worth as a person from his mistakes in this situation. As the 1-year anniversary of their departure approached, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. My home was fully mine, again arranged for my comfort and joy. My garden had begun to recover new plants, taking root alongside survivors of Jessica's landscaping intervention. My health had improved dramatically, no more stress, headaches, insomnia, or weight loss. But the most significant transformation was internal. I moved through the world with a newfound confidence, a certainty that I deserved respect and consideration. I no longer worried about appearing disagreeable when stating preferences or declining requests that didn't serve me. I had learned that there was a middle ground between doormat and dictator, a place where healthy boundaries and genuine kindness could coexist. Ethan and Jessica ultimately separated, a decision that brought its own complex emotions. While I never wished for my son's marriage to end, I recognized that it had become a relationship where neither person could truly flourish. We talked openly about the grief that comes with such endings, the mourning of what might have been the fear of starting over. Through these conversations, our mother-son bond strengthened, becoming more authentic than it had been in years. The journey from victimhood to empowerment is rarely linear. There were still days when doubts crept in, when I questioned whether I had been too harsh or not firm enough. But these moments became less frequent as I settled into my reclaimed life, surrounded by people who respected my boundaries and valued my true self. If there was a single lesson I carried forward, it was this: love does not require self-sacrifice to the point of erasure. True love, whether for family, friends, or partners, thrives in the soil of mutual respect and clear boundaries. In standing up for myself, I hadn't diminished my capacity for love. I had enhanced it, creating space for relationships based on authenticity rather than appeasement. Have you ever had to reclaim your space or your sense of self from someone who took advantage of your kindness? I hope my story has resonated with you in some way. If you found value in what I've shared, please consider subscribing to hear more life stories and lessons learned the hard way. Leave a comment sharing your own experiences with setting boundaries and how it changed your relationships for better or worse. Thank you for listening, and remember that advocating for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary for your well-being and for creating healthy relationships with those around you.